Israel, after this attack by Iran, after this retaliation, is saying that there's a war declared on them, that there's going to be a massive response on their part. There's also the fact that they had just declared a ground invasion. They're calling limited, but it's hard to know on the Israeli side whenever they use the word limited or anything to that effect, whether anyone could trust such a thing, given that they've already been committing massacres in Lebanon over the past 2 weeks to a month. But I wanted to ask you about the broader implications of this, the overall picture that we are seeing. I think on the one hand, of course, there has been so much devastation wrought by what Israel has done to the Palestinian people, Lebanese people, and of course, the region at large. But we're also seeing this escalation move into a place that seems to be perhaps more than Israel biting off more than it can chew in many ways. I'm just thinking about an invasion of Lebanon. The more that goes, the more that they are going to run into Hezbollah fighters face to face, hand to hand, and their arsenal and their tunnels.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that because they haven't achieved any of their strategic or operational goals in Gaza, that they bit off more than they could chew with Hamas. But that's just kind of a funny talking point. When it comes to the invasion of Lebanon and them calling it a limited ground invasion, well, I remember the last time they called it a limited ground invasion and it ended up in a 20-year occupation. So, like, or not, yeah, just it ended up in a permanent occupation. And so I think never trust what the IDF says. Their stated goals are giving really Iraq war vibes, where they're kind of nebulous. They don't know how long they're going to be there or what they're going to do. So I don't know. As someone who fought in an illegal war, kind of reminds me of the same thing. That's definitely not going to work. Now, speaking about the invasion itself, they're having to move troops out of Gaza, which, you know, Hamas is still active in. They're able to attrit Israeli forces and armor on a regular basis to the northern front. What are their goals? Well, they want to establish a buffer zone in order to roll Hezbollah back, presumably to the Litani River, because they always talk about the Litani River. They think that will be enough standoff distance where Hezbollah will not be able to target northern Israel, because I assume that they will redeploy air defense systems inside the buffer zone that can intercept them before they get to the northern Israel. So they want to, have a buffer zone. Okay. Well, that means you have to control all that ground inside the buffer zone. So that means you're going to have to clear through all the southern Lebanon, up through the Litani River, clear the tunnel system so you don't have Hezbollah anti-tank teams popping up in your backfield, taking out a tank and disappearing. Like you couldn't secure the ground in Gaza, but now you think you're going to do that in Hezbollah, who's historically outmatched you. Like it kind of doesn't make sense, because if you read reports, and I often reference this white paper that the Pentagon put out and some of the subsidiary literature from it. You can look it up if you guys want. It's called if you Google it, it's called "We Were Caught Unprepared: The 2006 Lebanon Israel Hezbollah War." It was written by the Combined Arms Institute of Combat Studies out in Fort Leavenworth, which is like one of the premier U.S. military war colleges. And it's the opinion of the U.S. military that Israel was strategically defeated, and the entire paper goes through why. And it doesn't seem like it's true that the Israeli military hasn't updated their tactics, techniques, and procedures since the 2006 Lebanon war, whereas Hezbollah has completely changed as an organization and military structure, and in terms of their armaments and arsenal. So what did Israel do back in 2006? Well, the same thing they're doing now. And bombing campaigns, intense information operations to portray a vision of victory for the IDF and a vision of ignominious defeat for Hezbollah, and mechanized maneuvers, which we're not seeing that now. A failure to achieve combined arms, where you have infantry working to protect the tanks, which are the big, heavy gun platforms with artillery in the back. They do the same thing now that they did in 2006, which is just stay buttoned up in their tanks because they're scared, because they're not actual professional soldiers. Most of them are like getting called back into service from working, cush jobs in Tel Aviv doing IT. And now they're part of a tank crew and they don't want to get out because they don't want to get sniped. And so what's Hezbollah going to do? The same thing Hamas is going to do. They're going to pop out of a tunnel, hit it with an anti-tank round or an explosively formed penetrator slapped on the crew entrance, and they're going to get mixed up. And if they couldn't defeat Hamas, who has only dual-phased RPGs that really can't effectively cause engine kills or crew kills, but they're still disabling massive amounts of armored vehicles, what's going to happen when they go up against the Cadillac stuff? It's a stupid operation from the beginning. They don't have the capacity to do it. Like if they dismantled Hamas and didn't get so heavily attrited in Gaza, which, I mean, they won't be able to do it. But if they did that, I'd be like, okay, maybe there's something here. But no, Hezbollah is way scarier because they're not having to train and operate in an open air prison camp, and they have open supply lines, which Hamas doesn't. Israel can like blockade the Syria-Lebanon border all they want, but they're not going to get every tunnel, just like they haven't got every tunnel in the Philadelphia corridor in between, Egypt and Gaza. It's a fundamentally stupid operation. It's strategically risky as all. And I don't see. I haven't talked to a military analyst, even one who's like a Zionist, like actual Zionist, who's like, this is a good idea. So that's where we're at with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this even in the mainstream media. There was a lot of bluster about Saeed Hassan Nasrallah being killed.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some, you could find op-ed pieces of these arch neocons drooling over, oh, well, look at all these leaders that have been killed. Hezbollah, IRGC, Hamas. Wow, things are really turning around. But then you'll find a lot of other publications saying, oh, no, Israel is really spiraling into an unwinnable situation, one that could certainly plunge everything into chaos. And I've been to Vietnam and I've been to the Cu Chi tunnels. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese did not have the same capabilities as Hezbollah has in its arsenal right now. So the amount of damage that even the Vietnamese could do with these tunnel networks and with, of course, knowing the terrain and all the things that have to do with guerrilla warfare, they seem to be magnified for Hezbollah, which has, as you said, supply lines and an arsenal and capability that already scares Israel and the United States. So to go through with moving up the escalation ladder from aerial campaign to minimal ground invasion to what seems to be on their way to a full ground invasion seems to be suicide. And I just don't know why. So, or at least I have an idea why. Expansionism, of course. But it seems like the why is perhaps not the right time. And I'm curious on your thoughts.
Well, I can give a couple of. I don't think it's just expansionism. A lot of them actually think they can win this. You brought up Vietnam. If you study the history of the Vietnam War from the U.S. military's perspective, they would achieve a massive victory against Vietnam leadership. They'd kill a lot of the Viet Cong, and they would use these occasional victories, which were less effective than they thought, to manufacture, consent to keep sending troops and to keep staying there, because it's like, oh, we just did this. We're closer to victory now than ever, when they never really were. There's a lot of historical examples of this. I remember in Afghanistan when we were like engaging the Haqqani, which was they're now part of the Taliban, but they were basically like an ISI Pakistani ISI proxy. They were like Zadran Pashtuns. We like rolled up their entire like network, and a couple of my one of my sister ranger platoons captured Haji Mali Khan, which was Jalaluddin Haqqani's uncle, like one of the big fish of the entire thing. It's like, all right, we're really close to like shutting this thing down. And flash forward 20 years later, 10 years later, like where are we? So like, I understand the thought process, because when I was still in the military, I thought about it this way, and it's completely wrong. And I understand it's delusional, but it happens all the time.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the Afghanistan example, you have so much knowledge of it firsthand, but I know that your knowledge expands way beyond that. But even just from the outside, the Afghanistan example, it seemed like the United States' occupation, right? This imperial hubris, they thought, we have this down, this is just ours. The Taliban, they're doing their thing, but they're not anywhere close to challenging the ability of the U.S. to comfortably sit there and continue both military and, of course, all the other arrangements that have to do with occupation. But then in 2021, the Taliban made very quick work. Of course, it took many, many, many years for this, but it was in the perspective of many Americans, many people in the United States watching. It seemed like in just a day that the United States was being run out of there. I mean, is this the kind of fate you see perhaps Israel facing if it does go through with its possible full-scale invasion of Lebanon, if its words about limited truly cannot be believed?
So here's the main trap. I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way. Here's the main trap of military occupations, right? Uh, fourth generation warfare, like asymmetrical state versus non-state actor. The state actor has tanks, infantry divisions, air force, a whole fleet of Reaper and Predator drones, this entire high speed, sophisticated spyware, intelligence agencies, and a lot of resistance movements or insurgencies just have a guy with an AK-47, a network of street contacts, and you're never that those forces, Hamas is never going to defeat someone like the IDF, even though I think most of their baseline troops are wildly incompetent and undertrained beyond the scope of this. They can never defeat them militarily, but they can defeat them politically, because as an occupational force, you have a window of legitimacy where the international community will tolerate you doing that. And it's economically burdensome. We can talk about why, but we'd have to get into capitalism. Like, it destroys the economy, but a few people make a lot of money off it. Again, beyond the scope of it. Hezbollah is very unlikely, or it's more likely that they can defeat in the field in more noticeable ways than Hamas can the IDF. But however, they don't have to, because if the IDF sweeps over and rolls up all the area into the Litani River, there's going to be an insurgency in that area, and the IDF can't win that. All Hezbollah has to do is just not lose and continue to attrit Israeli forces for however long it takes until the IDF eventually loses. I mean, the Taliban, there's no way they could defeat the U.S. military in conventional terms. You just can't. It's an insane idea. However, we pulled out of there, and who's in control now? That's the story of like every decolonial resistance movement. It becomes economically unsustainable, which the Afghan war did. The actual colonizers actually get so uncomfortable that they want to leave and go back to where they have other options to live, which is what we've been seeing in Israel since like December, was when the numbers got really crazy about how many people were permanently leaving. And they just have to not lose. Hamas just has to not lose, and eventually things will change. The balance of power will shift. They'll run out of political currency. And so, yeah, they could probably kill a lot of Hezbollah guys. Of course, a lot, probably more than, the IDF would get killed, because Hezbollah doesn't have, an entire fleet of Reaper and Predator drones and all this insane satellite spyware.
Yeah.
But again, that's just a principle of decolonial resistance movements. The insurgents are always going to take more casualties. The Vietnam took way more casualties.
Way more.
That's just how it works. But it's almost impossible for the occupational force, with all their military might, to win. That's just one thing I always want to talk about when it comes to this type of like fourth gen asymmetrical warfare, especially in the context of an occupation. So yes, they have no definable military or achievable goals. That makes their position even worse. it's just insane from the beginning. But again, I understand the delusion behind it. I didn't have the same problematic ideology as an Israeli soldier, but I still thought like, hell yeah, we're making real gains here in Afghanistan. Well, it's like we did sometimes, but it all came crashing down in the end, just like all these historical examples. So
Hmm.
I mean, in broad pictures, I don't know how the ground campaign is going to go. I think Israel is going to take a lot of casualties, and they have a very low tolerance for taking killed in action. So
Yes, very low. So low we don't hear about it. So low
so
we don't
low,
we never hear
so
about it.
low. There's a gag order.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just there's no way this can be good. So maybe it's limited. Maybe they only go into a few towns, but
right.
what will that accomplish? It's a fundamentally flawed idea from the start, and it can't possibly end well.
No, it definitely seems like time is not on Israel's side right now because it isn't. Even I always highlight this article that was written in, I believe it was August of 2024, talking about the long war that Israel has placed itself in by essentially opening up so many different fronts through its failures too initially. I mean, we always have to go back to this. I am glad you do, because there is so much of a propaganda smokescreen right now about this. We are told right now, I've been seeing it in the Western mainstream media, that Hamas is essentially done. Like they're essentially, which is not true, because you can find reports that say the exact opposite. And and if Hamas was done, there would be absolutely no reason for Israel to continue the fighting that it is doing right now. Uh, right now, it seems like time is not on Israel's side, that it has opened up all these major fronts, Hezbollah being now the biggest one, at least in terms of its recent escalations. And as you said, it doesn't seem like it's going to end well. It's just a matter of when will the consequences begin to bear fruit onto Israel. And one of the unique parts about this, Greg, and I want your comment on this, is that uh, 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 there have been so many colonial entities, so many colonial powers that have fallen over the course of several generations since the end of World War II. But Israel has this major backing from the United States, which essentially protects it. Do you see that protection uh, uh, continuing to be effective moving forward? Because even when I heard you were commenting on U.S. troop deployments and saying it's not that big of a deal, and while I was hearing, it's not World War III, I'm also hearing that, well, what is the United States going to do? Look at what happened with Iran. They couldn't actually shoot down all of the missiles that Iran launched. And how is the United States going to help if in a ground invasion against Hezbollah? How the United States has no appetite for U.S. troops to go marching into Lebanon and slaughtering people. I mean, I don't see there being much appetite. What do you think?
Well, first of all, there are a few thousand Marines attached to these carrier strike groups that were made to do an amphib deployment. And Lebanon has a coastline. Yeah, I don't see it happening. There's a couple of facets to this. After the unfortunately named global war on terror, the U.S. doesn't really seem to have an appetite for direct confrontation. We prefer to use proxies. Look at the war in Ukraine. Look at some of the things. Look at some of the anti-Houthi forces that we're funding in Yemen, to include ex-Al Qaeda leaders and stuff. Like, we're not really doing a lot of direct engagements. We don't have the public consent for a war, another direct conflict. And here's another thing: like the U.S. military, because it doesn't have the benefits that the military has, no longer really means as much in today's economy and culture. Also, there's a massive recruiting crisis because people are disillusioned seeing like people like millennials and like Gen Xers from our generation who deployed for what, and these horrendous suicide rates and massive mental health issues. Like, why do I want to sign up to go for a war? Like, and kids these days know Vietnam was wrong. Shouldn't have done it. They have a sense that some stuff in the 80s in South America was wrong. Shouldn't have done that. Desert Storm, shouldn't have done that. Iraq, Afghanistan, shouldn't have done that. So I guess like the next direct conflict war we get involved in would be for the right reasons. Like, give me a break. So there's massive recruiting crisis and there's a massive retention rate. Every branch is going to miss its figures by thousands, maybe with the exception of the Marine Corps for now. And that's incredibly degrading to capabilities. And it's not just recruitment, it's retention. Retention is where you sign a contract to re-enlist, and retention rates, and they aren't really reporting on this because they're bad, are not great. A lot of people are not signing up to get back into the military, which means you're losing all these trained, experienced people with like 10 years of professional experience. So any direct conflict, and this is like one of the main concerns of the U.S. military right now, this retention rate. How do you maintain readiness? Well, you don't. That what part of the debacle was about the aid pier is because there was some sort of mismanagement going on. A ship had to turn around from the strike fleet because it was not up to standards. Like there is serious degradation happening in the U.S. military. We're not prepared to fight a war. We're also not prepared to fight a war without public consent. And sure, a lot of people might want to still back Israel, but there's a distance between backing Israel and giving them money and then watching 2,000 Americans die on screen every night, because we do publish non-special operations soldiers who are killed overseas on news. So we don't have the same consent that we had during Iraq or Afghanistan in the post 9/11 years, because Israeli Hezbollah has really tried to connect October 7th to make it our 9/11, to manufacture that consent. But it doesn't matter how they try it. That doesn't have the same visceral experience. That's not going to get Americans to go want to do that. Like some will, 100%. If those Marines get tasked to deploy to Lebanon, they're going to follow orders and do it. But will the Joint Chiefs, the command echelon, given all these problems with the United States military and, you know, their geostrategic shift to like Taiwan and the China Sea in order to isolate China, that's like the next flashpoint they're looking towards. Do they want to get bogged down in what they disparagingly call the sandbox again and another forever war? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So when I see like, what are they going to do to support Israel? Well, they've just sent a few thousand more troops, and they're keeping an extra fighter wing with like F-15s, F-16s, F-22s, F-35 fighter bombers in the region, in the Gulf, to potentially run intercepts for Iranian rockets, or maybe hit Iranian proxies, or what they refer to as Iranian proxies, in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. I don't know if they'll attack Iran directly. It's insane escalation. But that's all I see the U.S. doing in this conflict right now. So when they say World War III, it's like, yeah, we got a few more rungs to climb up first. There's no combat divisions, active duty combat divisions getting deployment orders. Those take a long time to mobilize. I'm not too worried about it yet.